In the 40s, the biggest beast on America's railroad tracks were the Baldwin-Yellowstone mallees.
The cab hangs heavy with heat, not summer heat. This bites deeper. It crawls through your clothes, sits in your lungs. The fireman wipes his forehead. The sweat is gone before it even forms. February in Minnesota. The Yellowstone pulls more than 100 ore cars through it, each one loaded with iron that had to be steamed loose that morning. The engineer's hand rests on the brake valve, waiting. You don't play with 19,000 tons on a grade. You hope the air holds, hope the shoes don't glaze, hope the rails aren't hiding ice. Behind them, the stoker jams again, a coal chunk wedged tight. The fire drops, steam follows. The fireman reverses the motor, metal grinding loud enough to remember later. If it doesn't break loose, you are losing power with a mountain of ore pushing from behind. No one speaks, they don't need to. This is why the Yellowstone earned its reputation, not because of size, but because of what it had to do and where it had to do it. You see it immediately when you stand next to one. Why they had to build them this way. The DM&IR Yellowstones weren't designed to be impressive. They were designed because ore trains do not stop for you, and winter in northern Minnesota does not care about your schedule. 140,000 pounds of tractive effort. That number sits in books, and it means nothing until you understand what it moved. Iron ore, one of the densest cargoes railroads ever handled. 19,000 gross tons on the heaviest runs. The Mesabi Range fed the steel that armed the United States in World War II, and a huge share of that ore rolled behind Yellowstones at one point or another. The tender behind them held about 25,000 gallons of water. At full power, the locomotive could evaporate roughly 12,000 gallons per hour into steam. 12,000. You could heat several Minnesota homes for a winter on the coal it burned in 60 minutes. Around 10 to 12 tons per hour fed by a mechanical stoker because no human being could shovel that fast. But those numbers hide what really mattered. The crews knew it in their bones. Every Yellowstone had a firebox the size of a small room. That firebox sat directly behind the cab. In summer, cab temperatures climbed well over 100 degrees. Men worked 12-hour shifts in that heat, feeding coal, watching water levels, checking steam pressure. In winter, it was different. Your face froze while your back roasted. The temperature swings cracked skin and made every breath feel wrong. The all-weather cabs helped, heavy steel enclosed built to keep out the wind. But sealed meant something else too. When things went wrong, you had only seconds to react. February 7, 1943. The Duluth Iron Range locomotive number 224, leased to the Denver and Rio Grande Western, pulls a freight over Tennessee Pass in Colorado. The air brakes fail on the downgrade near the Fireclay Loop. The locomotive runs away. When it leaves the rails, the wreckage scatters down the mountainside. Wrecking crews spend days pulling equipment out of the snow. The Denver and Rio Grande Western had called them some of the finest engines to ever operate on their road, right up until the brakes failed. That was what crews on ore trains worried about most. Yellowstones pulled ore downhill from the mines to the docks on Lake Superior. Downhill meant gravity worked against you every second. Air brakes on more than 100 cars, each one depending on the one before it. One coupling fails, one brake line ruptures, one valve sticks, and suddenly you are testing how much margin you really have. Early 20th century boiler failures across several U.S. railroads had already shown exactly what happens when you ignore the fundamentals. The crown sheet, the top of the firebox, must stay covered with water at all times, always. If it does not, if the level drops even a few inches, the sheet can heat to well over 1,000 degrees in seconds. At those temperatures, steel loses much of its strength. Boiler pressure, around 240 pounds per square inch on a Yellowstone, can then force the sheet off the stay bolts. In tenths of a second, thousands of gallons of very hot water flash to steam. The expansion is violent. Water turns into millions of gallons of steam in volume terms. The force can throw the boiler clear of the frame, sometimes hundreds of feet. Crews rarely walked away without serious consequences when that happened. DM&IR 237 had a wreck with severe damage to the cab. Surviving records remain brief, but the result is clear. The cab side was torn open, steel bent back. Metal that thick does not bend easily. Whatever happened, it was hard enough that the locomotive was written off. They scrapped it afterward. There was no return to service. DM&IR 228 suffered a wreck at Wyman over the Wyman Creek Bridge. Ore cars were destroyed, spilling iron across the ravine. The locomotive itself was damaged worse than surviving photos clearly show. But the cold worked more slowly. Tower, Minnesota, February 2, 1996. The thermometer reads -60 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the coldest temperature ever recorded in Minnesota and the most easterly officially measured low in the United States. In other winters, parts of the state stayed below zero for days at a time without interruption. Natural iron ore held moisture. In spring and fall, that moisture turned to ice. Solid blocks of ore locked to the steel jennies by the cold. Workers pumped steam into the cars through fittings near the bottom. They stood in negative temperatures, waiting for tons of frozen rock to loosen enough to dump. The Yellowstones operated through all of it, 12-hour shifts in cabs that swung from oven heat near the firebox to frost at the windows. Metal contracted in the cold and expanded in the heat. Boiler plates were stressed, stay bolts fatigued. Firebox sheets developed cracks that inspectors sometimes only found during major overhauls. Mechanical stokers jammed often in winter. Coal froze together in chunks. The auger could not break them. The firemen reversed the motor, hoping the chunk would push back out. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it wedged tighter, and you had moments to decide whether to shut down or try to hand fire until the jam cleared. If you shut down with more than 100 loaded cars behind you on a grade, you were not starting again easily, not without help. And help was miles away, in cold that punished exposed skin in minutes. September 30th, 2010. Two Canadian National ore trains, modern diesels, collide head-on outside two harbors. Dark territory, no signals, just radio and paperwork. Engineer Dan Murphy sees it coming. He calculates his options: jump and take his chances on the ballast, or stay on the locomotive and absorb the hit. He chooses a third option. He lies down on the outside walkway and braces his feet against the cab wall. He uses his legs as shock absorbers. All 5 crew members on both trains are injured and transported to hospitals. 4 crew members are treated and released. 1 remains hospitalized for further treatment. Murphy has worked on the railroad for decades, and later he will say it plainly. Fatigue catches crews more than anything else. They were near the end of a 12-hour shift. The crash came when everyone thought they were almost done. The same math that put crews in danger in 1943 still works in 2010. Humans get tired. Systems fail. Margins disappear. The DM&IR owned 18 Yellowstones in total. 1 was scrapped early after an accident. The others lasted into the diesel era. They were retired between the late 1950s and 1963, replaced by diesel locomotives such as SD9s that did not need stokers, did not heat the cabs to oven temperatures, and did not have to take water every few dozen miles. Only 3 survive. Number 225 at Proctor, number 227 in Duluth, and number 229 at Two Harbors. They are static displays now, with cold boilers and empty tenders. But the men who fired them, who ran them through Minnesota winters with loads that would challenge anything smaller, those men knew something that does not fit on a museum placard. The Yellowstone did not forgive mistakes, not the small ones, not the big ones. You watched your water level, because if you did not, you were gambling with the crown sheet. You watched your brake pressure, because if you did not, a heavy train on a grade could get away from you. You watched your coal feed, or the fire faded and left you stalled on a hill with serious tonnage behind you. Steel does not teach lessons. It just reacts when you stop paying attention. And in Minnesota, in February, with deep sub-zero air outside, more than 100 cars of frozen ore, and a cab that is an oven at your back and ice at the windows, attention is all you have left.